up to chapter 22 in the Tanya. Just to review briefly what we've covered so far. The purpose of the Tanya, as the author states it, is to explain a verse in Torah where Moshe says to the people, serving God is not a difficult or foreign or unnatural activity. It's not a matter that is in heaven that you should ask who will go up to heaven and bring it to us. It's not on the other side of the ocean that you should ask who will go across the ocean and bring it to us. But instead, the matter, serving God, is close to you, very close to you, in your mouth and in your heart to do. Now, in the mouth means in speech, to do means in action, and the heart means with emotion, because the heart is primarily love and fear. The Alter Rebbe's question is, how can Torah say to every person, to every Jew, that serving God is very natural to your heart when we see that the heart does not naturally love God or fear God? It has other loves and it has other fears. In fact, it resists the love of God and the fear of God. So what does it mean that it is very close, very accessible, very natural to serve God with your heart? And for this, the Rebbe gives two answers. One approach is that it is very close and natural to serve God with your heart because the mind governs the heart. When a person thinks the right thoughts, it produces the right feelings, because the heart follows the lead of the mind. And because the mind is something that we always control, a person doesn't have difficulty studying or contemplating a subject that he chooses to contemplate. Unlike the heart that is drawn after its own desires, and you have to keep it in check, the mind is always obedient. If our mind is out of control, that's a sign of insanity. That's not a natural condition. So since a person can think and study any subject, any thoughts that he wishes to pursue, and the thoughts and the subject that we fill our mind with determines the emotions or the feelings that are going to result from that study and from that thought, it is therefore close to every person, natural to every person, to serve God with their heart, because it is natural that the mind controls the heart. So to produce a feeling of love for God, you have to think about God's greatness and kindness and closeness. To produce a fear of God, you have to think about God's awesomeness, infinity, greatness, distance, and so on. That's what the Rebbe tells us in the first 17 chapters. Then in chapter 18, the Rebbe says that there is another closeness, another fact that makes serving God with the heart close, in fact, very close. More natural even than the mind controlling the heart. And in chapter 18, the Rebbe says that a person who doesn't have the mind, doesn't have the intelligence, cannot contemplate God's greatness because he doesn't understand God's greatness. Not because of a lack of intelligence, but it's a different kind of mind that can grasp godliness so vividly that it would produce emotions in the heart. Because it would have to be vivid to stir the heart. So even a person who doesn't have that kind of mind or that kind of understanding of godliness, even so, the verse, it is very close to you in your heart, applies to him too. In what way? It's because we are born with a love for God already built into our soul, already built into the heart. We inherit this from the patriarchs. It is a divine love not produced by human intelligence, and therefore a truer love, a deeper love, and all we need to do is stir that natural love and serve God with our heart. What is the nature of this love? It's obviously not a very personal, romantic love, because it doesn't come along with knowing, with understanding. It is more of a natural, given, an instinctive love, which expresses itself in two ways. One, the desire to be connected to God, and two, the fear of losing that connection, not wanting to be disconnected. In other words, it is not the kind of love that we usually think of, the feeling of closeness and of warmth and so on. It is more an attachment, an identity, a connection without which we are not natural and we don't feel comfortable. You might compare it to a marriage where the connection between husband and wife is not always on a feeling level, but more of on an identity level. We don't want to be without each other. We don't want to be disconnected from each other, which means that we want to remain connected or become even deeper connected, but not necessarily on an external emotional actual feeling in the heart that we usually identify with love, but more a deeper kind of attachment, which means that we belong to each other, not only that we feel that way, but that it is that way. We are part of each other and therefore would not be comfortable getting separated. So this love, because it is inborn and natural, it's inherited, is available to every person, and we see it, the evidence for it, is the fact that even the lowest of the low, even the most careless and the most alienated Jew in history has been willing, in most cases, to give up his life rather than worship an idol, rather than bow to an idol. Why is that? Because the nature of this love that we inherit from the patriarchs doesn't permit severing our relationship from God or with God. And therefore, when told to bow to an idol or worship an idol or suffer death, even the lowest of the low cannot bow to the idol, because that would mean severing his relationship with God. Then the question becomes, if it is so natural for us to serve God with our heart, with love and fear, which means attachment and resistance to separation, to the point of self-sacrifice rather than bowing to the idol, then the question becomes, if this is true of the godly soul in everyone, how is it that the lowest of the low got to be that way? In other words, if he's willing to die rather than bow to an idol, then how did he get to be so sinful that we describe him as the lowest of the low? And for this, the Rebbe's answer is that the person forgets, or the person is out of touch with his true self, and convinces himself irrationally that sinning in all other ways, violating God's commandments in all other areas, doesn't damage his relationship or connection to God. Only bowing to an idol does, which is irrational. But this is how the lowest of the low gets to be so sinful and so distant from God, because of this self-deception, because of this artificial distinction between bowing to an idol and other sins. So to clarify this, the Rebbe starts to explain in chapters 20 and 21 how the two commandments, the first two commandments of the 10 Commandments, I am God your God, and you shall have no other gods, these two commandments basically summarize contain within themselves all 613 commandments. Because the commandment, I am God your God, means fulfill all positive commandments, all 248 do's, positive commandments, and you shall have no other gods means don't commit any of the sins, any of the prohibitions, the 365 don'ts in the Torah. How do these two commandments represent all the commandments? So the Rebbe begins to explain how I am God your God means the oneness of God. The oneness of God is described as a uniqueness of existence, not only of power. Not that God is the only powerful being, but that God is the only being. And that's because all of creation is non-existent by its own power, by its own steam. It exists only because God says, let there be. And the word, speech, doesn't get separated in God as it does in the human being. When a human being says something, once the word leaves his lips, he can no longer control that word. It has taken on an existence or a significance of its own, separate from the speaker. So that it would be correct to say that before the person spoke, there was just the person. Now that he spoke, there is also the word, or the words. But in God, when God speaks, the word doesn't leave him, because there is no place other than him, since God is everywhere. And so God's speech is very much like the human speech before it is spoken, while it's still in the human being. Then you would not describe two existences. You wouldn't say there is the human being and the speech, because the speech is just part and parcel of the human being. It hasn't become a separate entity. It's just that in the human being, once he does speak it, it takes on an independent existence. Whereas with God, even after the word is spoken, even after God says, let there be light, or let there be a firmament, or whatever, even then, the word remains within him, not separate from him, so that, correctly stated, only God exists and nothing else, because it's all part and parcel of him. Why then do we describe it as speech? What does it mean when we say God spoke if the word never leaves God? This is what the Rebbe says in chapter 22. The idea of speech in God means to describe not a separate entity, not something that leaves God and becomes an independent reality, but rather speech implies a descent. There's a process. First, there is an awareness in the mind, and that becomes a feeling in the heart, and that becomes a thought, and then the thought becomes words, and then those words are spoken with the mouth, which is really kind of an action. The movement of the lips is an action. So there's a process that goes on in bringing the energy from the depths of the soul out into the more external, the more tangible. So when we say that God spoke, it means that the energy with which God creates the world, the divine creative powers, came down the chain of levels within God from the most abstract to the most concrete. And that means that the energy takes on form and is concealed and hidden to where the presence of God is not felt in his creation. In other words, as he creates the world, he himself is not felt by the creation. It's like an anonymous gift. You're given a gift, but you don't know where it's coming from. So that's called the concealment of the face. hester panim. God conceals his presence in his speech, in his actions. So although he is there, and there is nothing other than him himself, yet that fact is concealed. How does this happen? Where does this happen? In the creation, there are two parts. There's the part of creation that God desires personally, truly, and objectively, for itself. God loves certain things. He creates them because this is what he wants. The goodness, the godliness in the world. But then there are those parts of the world that God creates without a true inner desire. He doesn't desire the thing for itself, only as a means to an end. So we say that all the evil in the world, the darkness in the world, was created to enhance the good, or to give us freedom of choice. What is the purpose of freedom of choice? That when we decide to do good, then the goodness is coming from ourselves, from our own volition, which gives us credit for the goodness. Whereas if we had no choice, if we couldn't help but be good, then the goodness would not be coming from us. It would be coming from the Creator who did this to us, and therefore, when we would do good, we would deserve no credit for it at all, which means that there would be no relationship. So God created the option of evil, the darkness, not as an end in itself, not because he enjoys evil, but because in some way the evil serves a purpose. Now when you do something, when you choose something, when you want something, not for itself, but for some other purpose, this is called hate. So when the Torah says that all of these evil things or unholy things or ungodly things are things that God hates, well, if he hates them, why does he create them? The understanding behind that is that God creates them because they're necessary, because they serve a good purpose, and in that sense they are fine. But in the contrast to those things that God loves as an end in themselves, for themselves, because they are intrinsically good, when we contrast that with the creation of those things that God wants but doesn't love for themselves, only as a means to an end, those things are the things that God hates, because there's no love there. So this causes a concealment, because when you create something without an inner will, it's like giving a gift to a person whom you don't like. But you have to give the gift, or you have to deliver the gift, and so you deliver it, you give it, but you avoid your face, you turn your face away, you don't want to look at them because you don't like them. This is called hiding the face. So hiding the face, concealment of the face, or hester panim, means that God gives life to parts of his creation without investing his inner will, which is what the face represents, the inner will. Now, when you give without inner will, you turn your face away, because what you're trying to imply, what you're demonstrating by turning your face away, what you're saying to the person is, I am giving you the gift, I'm delivering the gift, but it's not coming from the real me. It's coming through me, it's being delivered by me, but it's not from me, not from the real me. And that's what turning the face, or avoiding the face, means. Here's the gift, but don't think it's coming from me. Well, what happens when you give a gift that way is that the receiver, the recipient, feels that the gift was not meant for the real him. So there are really two messages here. I give you the gift, but it's not coming from the real me, and I'm giving it to you, but not to the real you, not to the personal you. I'm delivering it into your possession, but it's not about you. So when I do something that is not from my inner will, it's not an end in itself, then two things happen. It doesn't come from the real me, and it is not intended, it doesn't reach the real you or the real him. So when God creates that which is useful, but not that which he loves, that being receives energy, receives existence and life from God, but there's no relationship there. Because it's not coming from the real inner will of God, and is not intended for the inner being, which is unholy, which God does not want for itself, only as a means to an end. A third thing happens here. Let's use the example of a child. If the parent cares for a child, but without a true inner will, the child naturally will feel that all this attention and all this care is really not for him or her. It's just something that has to happen, but there's nothing personal there. The result might be that all the kindness, the actual factual kindness, the fact that the parents are taking care and providing for the child, all that kindness, which would ordinarily or otherwise make the child grateful and appreciative of the parents, in this case, where the kindness is given without an inner will, without a true will, the kindness itself becomes negative rather than positive force. So the child, instead of becoming more grateful and appreciative of the parents, will become more hateful, more spiteful by the kindness itself. Just the example of, if you were kind to me yesterday, you better be kind to me again today. And why is that? That's because the kindness doesn't fit, it doesn't take. It's as if the kindness were in exile within the recipient. So the godliness that gives existence to those things that are unholy doesn't make the object holier. On the contrary, it makes it more unholy, more rebellious against godliness, and it becomes more arrogant and starts to take on an independent existence, an independent will that is incompatible with its creator. And this is what we call idols. Idols means any existence that considers itself independent and separate from God. And what is that denying? It is denying not the existence of God, but the oneness of God. And that's why the Talmud, the Gemara, tells us that the early idolaters, the true idolaters, did not doubt the existence of God. And they would never think of replacing God with an idol. That was never part of the thinking. Because this is not rational at all. To make a statue and say this replaces the Creator is sheer nonsense. What they were saying, or what they were believing, is that God, who is the God of all gods, as they refer to him, is the ultimate power, he is the ultimate creator, he is the ultimate authority in the world, but he's not the only authority. He is the God of gods, more powerful than all other gods, but not the only existence. It's not that only God exists. God's existence is the greatest, the most powerful, the most original. But in addition to God's existence, there are other things that have their own existence as well. Not as great, not as powerful, but existing. So that doesn't deny that there is a God. It doesn't deny that God is God. It denies that God is one. So it's the oneness of God that is denied by idolatry. So idolatry means not the belief that God does not exist. Idolatry means the belief that in addition to God, there are other gods, lesser gods, smaller gods. So when the lowest of the low refuses to bow to an idol, what is it that he's resisting? What is it he's objecting to? What is it that he can't bring himself to do? He can't bring himself to worship an idol because he doesn't want to separate himself, sever his relationship with God. But by bowing to the idol, he is not denying God's existence. The idolaters themselves don't deny God's existence because that's totally meaningless. What they're saying is that God is the greatest of gods, but that this idol also has an existence. It also has a power, a will, an agenda. And the lowest of the low cannot bring himself to bow to this idol. So what is it that he can't bring himself to do? He can't bring himself to deny God's oneness. Because this connection, this relationship with God, has a certain nature to it, a certain quality to it, as does every relationship. The nature of this relationship is that it's exclusive, like monogamy. It's not that committing adultery denies the existence of your spouse. It doesn't deny the existence. It denies only the exclusivity, the oneness. So the lowest of the low can't bow to the idol, not because the idol denies God, but because the idol considers itself in addition to God. In addition to God, there also exists an idol. And that, the lowest of the low, cannot bring himself to engage in or to even get close to. And that's why he will not bow, even though there's nothing going on inside. He's not worshiping the idol. He doesn't believe in the idol. He's only asked to bend over, to bow in front of the idol. He can't do that either. Because the oneness of God is so deeply ingrained in the soul that the thought of denying or even acting as if he were denying the oneness of God is too painful and too unnatural. It violates the godly soul within us, and we can't do it. If that's what idolatry means, then the Alter Rebbe will go on to say, every sin does that. In essence, every violation, every sin denies the oneness of God, not only the bowing to the idol, and therefore the person who won't bow to an idol also should be incapable, for the very same reason and to the very same degree, should be incapable of committing any of the sins, any of the 365 prohibitions in Torah.